There's a new voice in the Nolan Wells case this week, and it's not a witness, it's not a family member, it's a former FBI agent. And what she's saying is going to surprise some of you, because it doesn't point where a lot of the online conversation has been heading. When you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. That's Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI agent, speaking to News Nation about the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells. And I want to walk through exactly what she said, what it's based on, what's changed procedurally in this case, and why, even with her assessment, this is nowhere close to over. But before we get into this week's developments, I want to bring anyone new up to speed properly, and I want longtime viewers to sit through the full picture again too, because a case like this only makes sense when you're holding the entire timeline in your head at once, not just the newest headline. So let's build this the way it actually happened, from the beginning, and land on exactly where things stand as of this week. Nolan Xavier Wells grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, one of 6 children raised by Christine and Elmore. Football wasn't a side interest in that house. It was close to a family language. At Ocean Springs High School, Nolan played multiple sports, but football was where he stood out, not as the loudest presence in the room, but, according to his coach, as someone who led by example rather than volume. His principal remembered him the same way, one of the kindest, hardest-working students to come through the building. After high school, Nolan enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College, about 2 hours inland, where he walked on as a freshman wide receiver. He just finished his first year on campus and was due back for summer training camp on July 6th to start preparing for his first full season. That date matters because it tells you exactly what this trip was supposed to be. Not an open-ended summer blowout, but a short, ordinary break before the real work of the season started again. Independence Day fell on a Saturday. Nolan spent it the way he and this same circle of friends had spent it before, without incident. A boat trip out to Horn Island, a federally protected barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast. No development, no roads, no year-round law enforcement presence. Reachable only by boat, and packed on a holiday weekend with, by some accounts, hundreds of young people scattered along the beach. Here's the reconstructed timeline, built from GPS records obtained from Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources, not from anyone's memory of a chaotic afternoon. The boat carrying Nolan's group left its dock at approximately 9:56 in the morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14 a.m. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan alive places him on the island around 3 p.m. that afternoon. At around that same hour, someone aboard the group's boat placed a call for towing assistance. The boat's bilge pump had failed, and the vessel was taking on water. That call is now public record, released by MDMR, and it independently corroborates that this mechanical failure genuinely happened, hours before anyone knew Nolan would go missing. The boat left the island at 4:31 p.m. and returned to its dock at approximately 5:44 p.m. What's confirmed? A real mechanical failure, a departure without Nolan at 4:31, and a return to the mainland a little over an hour later. What's never been fully accounted for is the roughly 90-minute window between the 3 p.m. sighting and that 4:31 departure, the gap that sat at the center of this entire case since day one. Nobody called Christine that night right away. That changed just after 11 p.m., when her phone rang. Not Nolan, but one of his friends. She said publicly that was the moment something inside her shifted. Warren Cole reportedly called the Coast Guard around that same hour. The response was that the situation as described didn't meet the threshold for immediate deployment that night. Christine spent the rest of that night trying to track her son down herself, running into confusion over which agency held jurisdiction for a case originating on federal land, before the Jackson County Sheriff's Office finally opened a formal report. By morning, Elmore took his own boat out to search near Horn Island himself, while an organized search stood up on shore. The Sheriff's Department, MDMR, the National Park Service, the Coast Guard, and the Volunteer United Cajun Navy. For 2 full days, that search covered land and water with no result. Then, early on the morning of July 6th, a National Park Service ranger spotted a body in the water along the island's northwestern shore. It was confirmed to match the description investigators had circulated for Nolan. From there, the case moved into its forensic and legal phase, which is where most of the public confusion and speculation has lived ever since. The state autopsy was conducted July 7th. The medical examiner's office has said there's currently no indication of drug or alcohol involvement, though that reading is explicitly preliminary, pending toxicology results that officials said could take weeks. An independent autopsy commissioned by the family, conducted separately in Washington, D.C., returned a cause and manner of death listed as undetermined. 2 autopsies, 2 labs, and as of the most recent reporting, neither has produced a public, confirmed answer. The single fact both sides agree on without dispute: the swimsuit recovered on the body matched the one Nolan had been photographed wearing earlier that day. What they don't agree on is what that fact means for how he ended up in the water. Ben Crump, the family's attorney, has argued that a strong swimmer at a crowded holiday beach isn't the kind of person who simply disappears unnoticed. The county coroner has offered a different frame, describing the current in that specific area as strong, with a documented history of drownings, independent of this case. A leader from the United Cajun Navy has occupied a position between both, saying the rip current there was strong enough to challenge even a strong swimmer, while also wondering how nobody among that many people on the beach reportedly noticed someone in distress. There's also been a widely circulated video, a friend heard on tape demanding a phone back, a moment Crump initially suggested might be Nolan's voice. That claim was later directly disputed by a friend named Tracken Shepard, who said the voice was his own, from an entirely separate altercation, and that Nolan isn't even shown in the footage. Crump has since publicly walked that claim back, saying his team would be more careful going forward to frame single witness claims explicitly as claims rather than confirmed fact. A real, meaningful correction that a lot of the internet still hasn't caught up with, since the original clip continues to circulate as though it was never revisited. Then there's the phone itself. When Nolan was reported missing, his phone wasn't with him. It surfaced in the possession of a friend. When Christine and her sister tracked it down and accessed it, both of Nolan's Snapchat accounts were empty, despite Nolan reportedly documenting gatherings like this one regularly, and despite that kind of content typically still being retrievable within the app's normal 24-hour window. Some text messages also appeared to be missing. None of that alone proves tampering. People clear phones for all kinds of reasons. But it's part of why, following a meeting between the family and the district attorney's office in mid-July, both sides agreed to a mutual, simultaneous forensic inspection of the device, with investigators and the family's own experts examining it together, seeing the same data pulled the same way, specifically so neither side can later dispute how it was handled. There was also a specific procedural grievance raised at that same meeting. Under Mississippi law, crime victims' families are entitled to receive an incident report within a specific window, cited by the family's attorney as 72 hours. That window had long passed by the time of the meeting, and the family still hadn't received it. Following that meeting, the district attorney's office agreed to become the family's primary point of contact going forward, through a dedicated victim advocate. Nolan was laid to rest on July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Christine made a deliberate choice about the tone of that day. "We want to celebrate Nolan," she said. "He would not want us sitting around crying." Reverend Al Sharpton officiated. In his eulogy, he pushed for answers, while explicitly declining to prejudge the case in either direction. "We cannot say it was racist, but we cannot say it was not racist. So let's not judge either way until all the evidence is in." Christine also had a message specifically for Nolan's friends, the same friends whose accounts of that day remain at the center of so much public dispute, asking them to take care of their own mental health, acknowledging that this has been a lot for them too. Her teacher emailed the family afterward just to tell them about it. A small gesture, but one that Christine has said stuck with her, because it captured something true about who her son was, without anyone asking her to describe it. That's the full picture as it stood before this week. Now let's get into what's actually new. The case is now formally headed to a Mississippi grand jury, which will decide whether anyone is charged in connection with Nolan's death. The district attorney's office has said evidence will stay out of public view until the grand jury reviews it first, a move prosecutors describe as protecting the integrity of the investigation, not as withholding information for its own sake. I want to be precise about what that actually means procedurally, because I think it gets misunderstood constantly. A grand jury referral for an unnatural or suspicious death is standard procedure in Jackson County. It does not, on its own, mean criminal charges are coming. It means a panel of citizens will review whatever evidence prosecutors present and decide whether there's enough to support formally moving forward. There's no defense presentation at this stage, no media coverage of the proceedings themselves, and even the family's own attorneys won't be present in the room. That procedural reality is directly connected to why so much of the physical evidence in this case, the toxicology, the full autopsy findings, additional digital evidence from the phone inspection, may stay sealed for a while longer. It's not that investigators are hiding something from the public out of malice. It's that releasing evidence piecemeal, ahead of a grand jury seeing it in full, risks shaping public opinion in a way that could actually complicate the process meant to determine what happens next. I want to spend a little more time on how grand juries actually function, because I think the secrecy itself is one of the more misunderstood parts of this entire process. And misunderstanding it fuels a lot of unnecessary suspicion. Grand jury proceedings in Mississippi, like in most states, are secret by design, not as an exception made for this particular case. There's no media coverage of the actual proceedings, no defense attorneys present. The family's own attorneys, despite everything they've done to push this case forward publicly, will not be in that room either. It's simply a prosecutor presenting evidence to a panel of ordinary citizens, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people in this jurisdiction, who then decide on their own, without any outside inspection of their deliberations, whether probable cause exists to move forward. That secrecy exists for reasons that have nothing to do with this specific case. It protects witnesses who might otherwise be reluctant to testify candidly if they knew their words would become public immediately. It protects the accused, if there ultimately is one, from having unproven allegations permanently attached to their name before any formal charge is even filed. And it protects the integrity of the evidence itself, preventing public opinion from calcifying around a partial picture before the full picture has even been assembled in one room. None of that changes how frustrating it is to sit outside that process as a family desperate for answers, or as a public that's been following this case for weeks. But it's worth understanding that the silence right now isn't unique to Nolan Wells' case. It's how this exact mechanism works for every case that reaches this stage, regardless of how much attention it's drawing. There's also a meaningful difference between a grand jury declining to indict and a case simply falling apart from carelessness, and it's worth naming that distinction clearly too. If the panel eventually declines to indict anyone, that outcome on its own wouldn't necessarily indicate wrongdoing by prosecutors, or that they mishandled the case. A grand jury's threshold for probable cause is intentionally different and lower than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard a trial jury would need. It's entirely possible for a case to have real, substantial evidence and still not produce an indictment, just as it's possible for an indictment to happen and still not lead to a conviction months or years down the road at trial. Every stage of this process asks a different, narrower question than the one the public actually wants answered, which is simply, what happened to Nolan? Now, Jennifer Coffindaffer's assessment. She's a former FBI agent, and she reviewed what's publicly available: surveillance footage, witness accounts, Coast Guard communications, and the riptide conditions in that specific area of Horn Island. Her read, based on that public record, leans toward this being a tragic accident rather than foul play. She's not the first to raise the riptide conditions specifically. Members of the United Cajun Navy involved in the original search made similar points weeks ago, describing that stretch of water as having a documented history of drownings independent of this case. But, and this matters, Coffindaffer didn't say the case is closed, and she didn't say the public has the full picture. Her exact words, "I doubt if this, what we know, will come back with the truth." That's a former federal investigator explicitly warning that what's publicly known right now might not be the complete story, and that more details could still emerge. I want you to sit with that sentence, because it's doing two things at once. It's an experienced assessment that leans toward accident based on the available evidence, and it's an explicit caution that the available evidence isn't necessarily the whole evidence. Those aren't contradictory. They're just both true, from someone whose job for years was making exactly these kinds of calls with incomplete information. It's worth understanding what an assessment like this actually is, and what it isn't. Coffindaffer isn't a party to this case. She hasn't reviewed the sealed autopsy findings, hasn't seen whatever the toxicology results eventually show, and hasn't had access to the phone data currently under joint forensic inspection. Her read is explicitly built on the same public record available to anyone following this case closely: released surveillance footage, public witness statements, published Coast Guard communications, and documented information about the water conditions in that part of Horn Island. That's not a knock on her assessment. Former federal investigators bring real, valuable pattern recognition experience to public commentary like this, built from years of working cases where the initial public narrative and the eventual full picture didn't always match. But it does mean her read carries the same limitation every outside commentary on this case carries right now. It's built on a partial record, by design, because the fuller record is currently sealed for the grand jury. That's precisely why her caveat matters as much as her headline conclusion does. A less careful commentator might have simply said, "This looks like an accident," and left it there, and that clip alone would have traveled much further online than the fuller, more careful version she actually gave. She didn't do that. She paired her conclusion with an explicit acknowledgement of its own limits, which is a meaningfully different, more responsible way to offer public commentary on an active, still developing case. Approximately 60 witnesses have now been interviewed as part of this investigation. That's a substantial number for a case this size, and it tells you the sheriff's office and the FBI's supporting role haven't been treating this as a quick, low-effort case, regardless of what conclusion they ultimately reach. It's worth remembering, too, that the FBI's confirmed role here has never been about investigating Nolan's death directly. Their public statement specified their involvement centers on interstate threats made against individuals connected to this case, running parallel to, not merged with, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office's lead role in the underlying investigation. Now let's talk about the national attention, because this case has pulled in voices well outside the usual true crime space. Sports commentator Stephen A. Smith raised the case publicly during an interview on News Nation's Cuomo, pushing for answers and making a simple, human point, that parents who send their kids out for the day expect them to come home. Smith also spoke to a specific dynamic that's been part of the public conversation around this case from early on, describing suspicion within the Black community about how Nolan's death has been handled. I'm not going to characterize that suspicion for him or expand on it beyond what he actually said, because it's his framing to make, not mine, but I think it's worth including here because it's part of why this case has drawn attention well beyond Mississippi, and it echoes concerns that Jackson County's knock-up chapter president raised earlier in this investigation about race being part of how this case is perceived, even while he explicitly cautioned against jumping to conclusions in either direction. That's a difficult needle for any public figure to thread, naming a real, widely felt concern about equal treatment under the law, without asserting a specific conclusion about this particular case ahead of the evidence. It's worth recognizing when someone actually threads it carefully, rather than treating every public comment on this case as either an accusation or a dismissal. I want to spend a bit more time on this specific thread of the story, because it's been present in this case from very early on, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Jackson County Knox's president, Curly Clark, addressed it directly weeks ago, saying plainly that he wants to see less conjecture and more coming together, while also acknowledging, in his own words, that race is part of the equation here. He called for deliberateness in how the investigation proceeds and for the facts to come out so that justice can genuinely be served. That's not a call to presume guilt on anyone's part. It's a call for the process to be conducted with enough visible rigor and transparency that its eventual outcome, whatever it turns out to be, can actually be trusted by the community watching it unfold, including a community that has real, historically grounded reasons to watch cases like this one especially closely. I think that context matters for understanding why Stephen A. Smith's comments landed the way they did, and why national commentators well outside the true crime space have felt compelled to weigh in on a missing person case out of coastal Mississippi at all. This was never purely a story about a boating accident, even if that's ultimately what the evidence bears out. It's also a story about whether a family without institutional power can get sustained, careful attention from a legal system, and whether that system's transparency holds up under real public scrutiny. Both of those things can be true regardless of what the grand jury eventually decides, and I think it's worth holding on to that distinction rather than collapsing it into a simpler story in either direction. Here's the development I think most of you are actually here for. There's now a name attached to the young woman at the center of the case's biggest open question. Reporting from the Daily Mail has identified her as 19-year-old Katie McCormack. If you've been following our previous coverage, you'll remember we referred to her only as Katie, based on how she'd been described in earlier reporting and by Nolan's mother, Christine, who met with her directly, face-to-face, weeks ago. That name is now public. And with the name comes a second account, this time from her side of the family. McCormack's sister, Gracie, has reportedly pushed back on the version of events attributed to Warren Hudson and the other friends, saying that Nolan was actually ready to leave with the group, not that he'd chosen to stay behind to keep talking with Katie. I want to slow down on this, because it's exactly the kind of moment where a case like this can get flattened into a clean contradiction that isn't actually as clean as it looks. Recall what we laid out in earlier coverage. Katie's own account, relayed through Christine, was that Nolan told her his intention to rejoin his friend's boat, but that she never personally watched him do it. That's an assumption based on a real conversation, not a first-hand claim about what happened after. Now Gracie is saying Nolan was ready to leave with the group. Depending on exactly when that statement refers to, both of these things could be describing the same underlying reality from two different vantage points, at two different moments, rather than two people directly contradicting each other about a single fixed fact. That's actually exactly how Coffindaffer read it too, when asked about the conflicting accounts. Her assessment: I think it's more of a timing issue rather than something that is untrue on either end. In other words, an experienced investigator looking at both versions doesn't necessarily see a lie on either side. She sees the strong possibility that both accounts are honest, and that the real gap is about sequencing, not about somebody fabricating what happened. Nolan telling Katie he intended to leave, and Nolan appearing ready to leave with the group according to Gracie, aren't necessarily in conflict. The open question is still what happened in the specific window after that. The same roughly 90-minute gap that's been the center of this entire case from the beginning. I think it's worth pausing on why that specific reading matters so much, for how the public should be processing this case going forward. It would be a much cleaner story, honestly, if one side were simply lying and the other were simply telling the truth. Clean contradictions make for compelling narratives. One witness says this, another says that, and somebody has to be wrong. But real events, reconstructed after the fact by multiple people under emotional stress, on a crowded beach, over a span of hours, rarely produce that kind of clean contradiction. What they produce instead is exactly what we're seeing here: overlapping, partially consistent accounts that each capture a true slice of what happened, without any single account capturing the whole thing. An experienced investigator's job is to find where those slices actually fit together, not to pick a winner between them prematurely. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because it's shown up more than once already in this case. Nearly every piece of witness testimony we've covered across our coverage of Nolan Wells has arrived first through an intermediary, a relative posting on social media, a family friend relaying something secondhand, before, sometimes weeks later, arriving more directly from the actual source. Katie's account came to the public that way. Gracie's account is arriving that way right now. Each time that's happened, the version that first circulated publicly has turned out to be close to, but not perfectly identical to, the fuller version that eventually followed. That's not evidence of anyone lying. It's simply what happens when information passes through multiple people before reaching a wide audience. Details soften, get generalized, or get slightly reordered, without anyone along that chain necessarily intending to mislead. It's worth keeping that pattern in mind for whatever the next account in this case turns out to be, because based on how this story has unfolded so far, it likely won't be the last time a second-hand version and a more direct version don't perfectly match up. So where does this actually leave us? A former FBI agent's public read, based on available evidence, leans toward accident, but with an explicit warning that the full truth may not yet be public. A grand jury process now formally underway, with evidence intentionally sealed until that process runs its course. National attention that's pulled commentary from well outside the crime space, including questions about how race may be shaping public trust in this investigation, and a newly named central witness whose account, through her sister, adds a second layer to a timeline question that still isn't fully resolved. None of this changes what we've said from the very beginning of our coverage, and I want to repeat it plainly here because it's still accurate. No cause of death has been officially confirmed. No one has been charged with anything. The formal autopsy findings remain unreleased. What's changed is that we now have an experienced outside voice weighing in on the public evidence, a name attached to a key account, and a clearer sense of the legal process ahead. I also want to say something about how this case has been covered more broadly, because I think it matters as much as any individual fact we've walked through today. This story has generated an enormous amount of online speculation, more than almost any case of its kind in recent memory, much of it moving significantly faster than the actual evidence has. A pool party photo claiming to show Nolan alive after July 4th was traced through photo metadata to over a week before the trip. A viral video and quote were shared as confirmed fact within hours, and directly walked back weeks later by the very attorney who first shared it. Threats serious enough to draw federal attention have been sent to multiple people connected to this case, none of whom have been charged with anything, including AI-generated fabricated content targeting Nolan's own mother, in the middle of her planning his funeral. I raise all of that again here because it's the actual backdrop this week's developments are landing against. A former federal investigator publicly saying the evidence leans toward accident is the kind of statement that could easily get flattened online into either the case is solved or she's covering something up, depending on what someone already wanted to believe walking in. Neither of those readings is accurate. What she actually said was more careful than either extreme, an assessment based on the public record, paired with an explicit acknowledgement that the public record might not be complete. I think the responsible way to hold all of this, as a viewer, is to resist the urge to file this week's news under a single, tidy conclusion. It's genuinely possible for the following to all be true at once: that the physical evidence available right now leans toward an accidental drowning, that the family's continued push for full transparency is entirely reasonable and not evidence of anything sinister on its own, that the friends' accounts and Katie and Gracie's accounts are each honest but incomplete pieces of a single afternoon nobody has fully reconstructed yet, and that the case could still end without any charges being filed at all, simply because that's what the evidence, once fully assembled, actually supports. None of those outcomes cancel each other out. They're simply different pieces of an investigation that hasn't finished yet. We'll keep covering this the same way we have from the beginning. The grand jury's eventual decision, whatever comes of the sealed evidence once it's released, and anything further from either family, as it's actually confirmed, not ahead of it. Subscribe if you want to be here when that happens.